Okay, good morning. My name is Scott Kowalski with the law firm of Petty, Livingston, Dawson, and Richards here in Lynchburg, Virginia. And on behalf of the Lynchburg Regional Business Alliance and our almost 800 members and their 43,000 plus employees, we welcome you to our 2020 Federal Candidate Forum. The Alliance proudly represents the counties of Amherst, Bedford, Appomattox, and Campbell in the towns of Alta Vista, Amherst, Appomattox, Bedford, and Brookmeal, as well as the city of Lynchburg. Day in and day out, the Alliance works to promote the regional economic growth and to enhance the quality of life of all the residents in our greater Lynchburg region. At this time of year, however, we like to encourage all of our members and indeed everyone in the region to participate in the electoral process, which begins with learning about those running for election and what their positions are on issues that are important to the Alliance. And of course, we encourage everyone to show up in November at the polls and cast their vote for their preferred candidate. Today, we are delighted to have the opportunity to interview Dr. Daniel Gade and to hear from him why he is running for office and what his positions are on issues that are important to us at the Alliance: congressional activity during the COVID-19 pandemic, the state of manufacturing, higher education funding, the state of U.S.-China relations, and more. Ultimately, each interviewee is encouraged to explain his views and why he should earn your vote. Welcome, Dr. Daniel Gade, to our interview. Before we begin our questions and getting your positions, we'd like to get started by hearing a little bit about you, your background, and why you're running for office, and what your priorities are.
Well, good morning, friends. I'm Daniel Gade, and as was already implied, I'm a candidate for United States Senate, and I'm hoping to earn your vote in November or before, since we are now in the early voting season. My background is that I'm a career servant of the Constitution. I enlisted in the Army when I was 17 years old, and a year later went to West Point. And from after I graduated from West Point in 1997, I embarked on an Army career that lasted 20 years of active duty service. Halfway through that time, I was serving in combat in Iraq and was wounded in combat twice and decorated for valor. The second time I was wounded was very, very serious, exceptionally serious, and I was transported to Walter Reed Army Medical Center, where I spent the next year enduring more than 40 surgeries, including the amputation of my right leg at the hip. So I'm a hip level amputee. And actually, in that experience, I was in the hospital with now Senator Tammy Duckworth. So she and I are friendly and have very similar experiences in that regard. But I had to remake myself after that. I went off to get a master's degree and a PhD in public policy. And in between those two, I was invited to work at the White House doing veterans policy, national disability policy, military health care, and a few associated things were in my policy portfolio. But I did that for President Bush at the end of the Bush administration for about 15 months. And then after I completed my PhD a couple of years later, I went on to be a professor at the United States Military Academy, where I taught for 6 years and taught leadership and ethics, as well as economics, public policy, political science, and related topics. Finally, I retired from the Army in 2017, and then went on to be a political appointee in the Trump administration at the U.S. Department of Labor, where I was one of the folks responsible for formulating policy related to how we do veterans employment, specifically the relationship between when somebody leaves the military, how do they get integrated into business, and how does that, to use a metaphor, how does that sword of the soldier get converted into the plow of the civilian worker? And so what we were doing is integrating those folks into the labor market, because we know that jobs are the most important thing as it comes to thriving. The best welfare program, the best way to prevent suicide, the best all of it for veterans is a job. And so I did that for about 15 months. And then I went back to academia. I'm currently a professor at American University in DC. Unfortunately, we're all online this semester due to COVID, but that's okay, because I can do that and do my campaign work at the same time, which is fine. And the reason I'm in this race right now is because I believe that we're poorly represented in the United States Senate. I don't think our values are represented well. I don't think that we have people in those jobs, and specifically Mark Warner, we don't have people there who are representing what is best about our Constitution, what's best about our country. And instead, they're serving only their party. And Mark is a party line guy. He's got a veneer of bipartisanship, but it's very thin. And if you look into his record, you find that he is a party line rubber stamp for his party's initiatives. And that's fine when his party is right. And it's absolutely inappropriate when his party is wrong, as they've been on many issues lately, including the CARES Act, which would have brought the most recent version of the CARES Act, which would have brought needed relief to Virginia families. Mark voted against it because his party asked him to.
Move on to the first question, which deals directly with the issue you just raised. So appreciate your introduction. And the first topic is congressional activity during COVID-19, which you were just referencing. In the first 2 months of the pandemic, Congress authorized roughly $3 trillion in coronavirus relief in 4 separate measures. These bills attempt to protect the American economy from long-term harm caused by stay-at-home orders and respond to the overall impact of the virus. These packages included billions of dollars in aid for testing, for education, small business relief, corporate relief, local and state government assistance. Several parts to this question. First, what is your assessment of the effectiveness of the bills that have been passed thus far? And what would you propose doing in the future? That's the first part of the question.
Since I'm a college professor, I would give the overall effectiveness of that legislative response maybe a B- or so. And the only reason I would give it a B- is because those bills were loaded with lard. They were loaded with excess spending that had nothing to do with COVID relief. You know, a famous example is the Kennedy Center, millions of dollars for the Kennedy Center, when in reality that wasn't necessary to keep our economy going, frankly. And so I'd give a B- because of lard, and also because in too many cases, it was very difficult, especially for small businesses, to get access to the Paycheck Protection Plan loans or grants that were authorized because of bureaucratic bungling. And so there were some lessons that should have been and hopefully were learned during that time. But the other piece is, you know, it's very hard to there's no counterfactual, right? We don't know what it would have been like without that relief. Certainly it would have been worse. But government action shapes responses and shapes future responses. And so what we need to do is move forward, and we should be passing additional relief that's targeted narrowly on those who are still most affected.
Thank you, Dr. Gade. And my next question is kind of a follow-on to what you just said about the future. Considering the impact on the deficit and the debt of these massive spending measures, what can Washington do, if it can do anything, to avoid having to continue issuing such large relief packages in the future?
Well, it's kind of it's a more complex question than it seems, actually, because it requires us to go into the past and say to ourselves, what would our world be like if we had a balanced budget amendment? Which, you know, a lot of politicians say they're for it, and then they get to Washington, D.C. and they say they're against it. My opponent in this race is an example of that. Somebody who said he was for that and now he's against it. And the reason is because they say, oh, well, it's just a political talking point. It's just a buzzword. And in reality, what we know is that a balanced budget amendment would make our political representation, make them do what is required of them, which is make the hard choices around spending and taxation to get us back into budgetary balance. So if we had that, then we would have a much smaller deficit. And then, because it's an emergency and because any balanced budget amendment piece of legislation would have an emergency safety valve, then we could spend directly on COVID. But now we are hampered by our poor past decisions, and there's just the cupboard is bare with respect to spending. I mean, our debt is going to be bigger than our entire economy this year for the first time in a long time, first time ever, I believe. Anyway, so that's a serious problem, but we're in it and we need to move forward. So the way to move forward is to do COVID relief bills that are skinny, that are tailored narrowly towards those industries and persons who are still most suffering, and to pass them. And the Senate tried to do that. And I'm ashamed to say that among others, Senator Warner voted against that.
Thank you, Dr. Gade. We're going to move on to another topic now, the state of U.S. manufacturing. One of the few positive developments during the course of the pandemic has been a renewed interest in seeing more overseas manufacturing return to the United States, bringing it back to shore. First question is, do you agree that certain manufacturing sectors should be encouraged to return to the U.S., including the production of pharmaceuticals, health and safety products, including personal protective equipment and other items? and the domestic manufacture of electrical equipment for the electrical grid?
Yes, absolutely. It's all three. What we've seen with COVID, especially the bungled Chinese communist response to it, the Chinese communist government of the PRC, what we've seen from them is bungling, and so now we're all alert to the fact that we have long supply chains that stretch out into the People's Republic of China and related countries. And so what we should be doing is helping move our manufacturing to either onshoring it to the United States, or in some cases moving it to, or helping it move, or encouraging it to move to places that are allied, or that we have some kind of relationship with. I for one don't have much of a problem with manufacturing in South Korea, for example. I served in the army in South Korea for 3 years. The South Koreans are our steadfast allies. But I would like to see that manufacturing for specific things come back to the United States for national security reasons, because that's a national security concern. So as you said, pharmaceuticals, some types of PPE, and some types of pieces of the electrical grid especially are things that could and should be done here, just as we already do with our with certain defense critical components. So that's something that you're right about, and I agree with you.
Thank you. Well, and as a follow-up to that question, what do you think the federal government could or should do to encourage that return, either to the U.S. or to overseas allies?
Well, what we saw in the mid 90s, I believe I've got that timeline right, but in the mid 90s with the Irish economies, the Irish economy had been the sick man of Europe for decades. It had been languishing, and part of it was high corporate tax rates. And so one of the things we can do and must do to encourage manufacturing in the United States is cut corporate tax rates. You know, there's this crazy idea out there primarily on the political left, but the idea that somehow corporate tax rates are, or that corporations are these evil, things. And I disagree. I think corporations are the lifeblood of our economy. Corporations are working hard to keep our economy going. Of course, they have a profit motive, as they should. And part of the reason, or part of a way to get our industrial base back to the United States is to use our ability to tax, or our ability to decrease taxes specifically, to bring those folks back, or to bring those industries back.
Thank you, Dr. Gade. Moving on to something you mentioned in the midst of your last answer is the state of U.S.-China relations, and more specifically with regard to trade will be our focus. Even before the outbreak of the COVID-19 pandemic, the state of U.S.-China trade relations has been volatile, if not bitter, as you know. COVID-19 has certainly complicated all those relations. Both countries have imposed tariffs on hundreds of billions of dollars worth of one another's goods. So the first question is, what is your position on allowing Chinese government-controlled or Chinese government-directed corporations to invest in certain critical sectors of the U.S. economy? That would include infrastructure, information technology, and other sectors. And if you want to comment specifically in your answer on Huawei or TikTok or any of the other specific corporations, please do so.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's no secret now, and potentially one of the silver linings to the COVID pandemic has been that it's focused our national attention on the problem of China. And it's no secret that the Chinese are not our friends. As a military person, we've been rehearsing war games against potential Chinese activity for decades. And there's a reason for that, because the Chinese have made it clear that they are our geopolitical foes, that they are not our friends. And, and on the one hand, they're trading with us, and on the other hand, they have a steel fist, potentially holding a weapon. One of those weapons is cyber. And in the late 2000s and up into the early 2010s, the Chinese were very invested in cyber activity that was compromising not just our national security apparatus, but also our industrial apparatus, our private networks and things like that. And our legislators were asleep at the switch. Our people who were supposed to be doing this, our intelligence committees, our legislators, our executive leaders were completely asleep at the switch, or they were beholden to the Chinese for some reason. And they've allowed the Chinese to infiltrate all of those. And so I'm deeply worried about the influx of Huawei in our 5G. I think that's a terrible, terrible mistake. Unless we can be 100% sure, which we cannot, that it's not that all of that is not compromised by Chinese intelligence services or by other espionage services. So we need to invest in U.S. 5G. We need to invest in our allies who are developing 5G, which we can trust, because we can't afford to have the Chinese spies and Chinese activity in all of our networks that are critical to our day-to-day survival, much less to our national security needs. So it's a real concern. You know, TikTok is it's a silly example, but TikTok is actually a way in which large amounts of our data are flowing over to the Chinese Communist government, and that's a huge problem. So everybody should be alert to it now. Even you know, Senator Warner has been friendly with the Chinese for a long, long time. And apparently recently he's been a convert to the fact that they've been our foe, which everybody who's been paying attention has known for decades.
Thank you, Dr. Gade. Now, in response to the Chinese government actions economically and otherwise, tariffs have been imposed over the last several years on hundreds of billions of dollars of goods. What is your position on tariffs? And as a sub-part of that, if you disagree with tariffs or if you have other proposals for what can be done to respond to the Chinese government actions, let us know what those are and whether they've been tested before.
Yeah, sure. As a general matter, I'm a free trader. You know, I believe that free trade between countries that are not foes has mutual benefit. You know, free trade between us and Canada, free trade between us and Mexico, because we're all just occupying this little piece of terrain together. You know, the USMCA is a great example. Those are ways that we can promote free trade, and we should in every possible example. But free trade requires two countries that are not adversaries to do it. It requires a relationship of mutual goodwill, if not full trust. And so what we've seen with China is that they're not worthy of our trust and they're not worthy of our goodwill. And so the idea of tariffs, as a free trader, the idea of tariffs horrifies me generally. But with respect to China, what we can do is inflict some pain on the Chinese through tariffs in order to modify their behavior. But if we're going to do that, if we use that very blunt force instrument of policy, we also have to provide relief for the Americans who it hurts, because our trade war with China does in fact hurt Americans. So for example, our soybean farmers right here in Virginia are hurt by, and our wheat farmers and our, you know, corn and all these other exports, hogs, all of these other exports are hurt by our trade war with China. And so we need to provide targeted relief to those folks if we're going to go down the route of a trade war. Now, I don't see any other good options other than tariffs at the moment, but I'm eager to explore other options if there are some, because tariffs are a very blunt force instrument.
Thank you, Dr. Gade. Now I'm going to move on to higher education. The Lynchburg region is blessed to have several excellent private and public institutions of higher learning. Most funding for colleges and universities comes from state allocations and tuition and fees paid by students and their parents. First question is, what do you think has been the main cause of the growth in the cost of higher education over the past decade or two?
Well, you know, as you know, or may know, I'm a college educator myself. I talked about that in my intro. I'm a professor at American University. Before that, at West Point. My wife and I run a homeschool, a very successful little homeschool, and my parents are teachers. So I deeply value education and all of what it does for communities and for individuals who are trying to grow their skills to match a modern economy. One of the things that we've seen driving higher education cost explosion is that we, frankly, and this hurts me, this pains me to say, we have too many people going to college. In our country, we've fetishized college and made college the sort of the marker for what is necessary for success in the world, when in fact, there are plenty of other ways that people can be successful and should be at much lower cost. So for example, we need apprenticeships for the sort of journeyman workers who run our electricity grids and fix our plumbing and build our homes, all of that. That's not a college degree. That's not college degree type work. And it's a mistake to send those people to college, probably. Another thing that we can do soon, and we should do, is make individuals bear part of the cost of their choices, and make universities bear part of the cost of their choices. What I mean specifically is this: our modern higher education, with the exception of a few schools, has become a factory of unprepared workers who are deeply steeped in grievance rather than in specific skills. And so I think what we need to do is we need to work very hard to get that linkage broken, because there's no reason why public universities should be teaching our students that America is a terrible place, as too many of them do. So part of the solution to that I've proposed is to make universities co-sign the loans of the students who come to them. And what that does is it puts all the incentives in a line so that the university is only interested in turning out graduates who can actually pay their bills. And that means graduates who are functional in the economy, and it would burn away a lot of those, I described them, and I'm unapologetically so, as garbage majors. It would strip away some of those garbage majors that are creating people who are not prepared to work in the modern economy. And the university wouldn't offer those degrees anymore. And if they did, they would bear part of the cost of those failed loans. So that's one of the ways that we can get all of this back in line. But that's a tough hill to climb, because this has been something that's been festering for about 50 years.
Thank you, Dr. Gade. And my next question was going to be, what would you propose that the federal government can or should do to adjust or mitigate the cost of higher education? The one thing you just mentioned was the co-signature of the university on the student loan. Do you have any other thoughts or ideas on what the federal government could do to somehow reduce those costs to basically the parents and their children?
Yeah, definitely. So there's a couple things, but just first, one more little point about co-signing those loans. Again, what it does is it makes sure that we have all the incentives in line, because far too often, when a university is flooded with applicants and all those applicants have access to federal money, then demand goes up. And as we know from basic supply demand theory, when demand goes up, the price goes up if supply is constrained. And so what we're looking at here is a price out of control situation. Now, there's a couple things we could do. Number one is there are some degrees that that we ought to have a GI Bill-like function for. So for example, our high tech and our healthcare sectors, I think we could have a GI Bill type structure where students who are committed to those industries are given very subsidized loans so that they can get through those pipelines, so that we can feed our industry and provide the safety necessary that healthcare workers do. That's a way that government can put its thumb on the scale for industries that really do matter, or degrees that really do matter. Another thing we can do is create a requirement that if you're going to be using federal student aid, that you should be required, or there's a possibility this might work, to require those students to go to a year or two of junior college first and knock out some of the very simple classes first, or the core classes first, and then they go on to a more expensive higher education at a state or private university. So there's a number of things we can do, but we just need to get aggressive about it, because it's a real problem, and it traps students. Far too often, it traps students in non-bankruptable large loans that they end up paying off for the next 20 years, hampering their ability to invest in businesses, hampering their ability to start new things, and to be productive members of society. It's a real problem.
Thank you, Dr. Gade. You mentioned healthcare a moment ago, and that's going to be the next topic. What is your position on healthcare generally in the U.S.? I know it's a very broad question, but going specifically to the Affordable Care Act, what is your position? Should the Affordable Care Act, the ACA, be left as is, modified, repealed? So to get your response on that.
Sure. Yeah. I've been critical of the ACA as a general matter for quite some time. And the problem with that critique, though, is that the ACA is law and has been now for 10 years. And so it's not going anywhere, and it shouldn't, because it's fully integrated into our society at this point. And so I, for one, am for protecting people with pre-existing conditions. That's something the ACA does, although clumsily it does that. And we need to continue to do that. That's the number one principle of healthcare, is that we must protect people with pre-existing conditions. Now, there are some areas in which the ACA has been a pretty abject failure. One of the things it doesn't do is do much to control costs. We've seen healthcare costs continue to skyrocket, and part of the reason for that is because individuals are making choices unrelated to the price of the choice that they're making. And the way to get around that is something the Trump administration has actually done lately, which is put in an executive order on price transparency. And so price transparency coupled with larger health savings accounts allows families to make that choice. And I always use the example of, if you've got a kid coughing and sniffling in the night, do you take that kid to the emergency room for $700, or do you take that kid to the emergency care clinic or the urgent care clinic in the morning for $70? Either way, you as a consumer should be bearing you should be feeling that in your health savings account. That helps you make a better decision, because consumers who don't see a price overconsume. That's why everybody eats too much at a buffet, because you're not seeing the price of an individual item. And so we need health savings accounts to be reinvigorated. We need to have price transparency. We need to have insurance sold and bought across state lines. Ultimately, we need to break the linkage between employment and healthcare, for the simple reason that it's inefficient and it impedes people's ability to switch jobs as they upskill and things like that. So there's a whole lot of work to be done on healthcare, and throwing up our hands and saying, oh, let's just let federal bureaucrats do it, is a terrible idea. That won't work. It'll blow out the bank, and it will result in decreased quality, decreased access, and increased costs. It's a terrible, terrible recipe.
Thank you, Dr. Gade. You mentioned several things that you would modify with regard to the ACA and HSAs being seemingly a big component of that. Are there any other modifications of the healthcare system in general that you would push for if you were elected?
Well, yeah, tying it to my earlier comments about education, it's clear that the future of healthcare in the United States has at least two important components which are under addressed right now. One is provision by non-physician providers. So in that, I'm talking about nurse practitioners and what are they called? Physician's assistants. Nurse practitioners and physician's assistants are really the future of primary care. Much of what they do is just as good as what a doctor does, and you don't need a doctor to do most of those. And so we need to increase our supply of those folks by providing incentives and all of that to get those folks through college and out into the labor market. Another really innovative thing that some people are doing is these things. It's called direct primary care, and direct primary care it's just absolutely awesome, because what it is a group of doctors are coming together, and they have the ability you pay a subscription fee to this group of doctors. You have your own private doctor, and that doctor has admission privileges and has the ability to refer you to specialized care and all of that. And what that does is help get consumers back in the driver's seat of their own healthcare decisions. And then the last piece that is for sure necessary is telemedicine. And far too often, state licensing boards have made it the case that you can't practice telemedicine in, let's say, Louisiana, unless you are licensed in Louisiana. So if your patient is elsewhere and you're doing especially stuff like psychiatric care and so forth, you can't do that across state lines far too often. And that creates real friction and lack of efficiency in the system. And so what we need is a nationwide scheme in which any telemedicine provider who is properly licensed in one state can practice in all 50 states. Just like if you have a driver's license in Virginia, you're allowed to drive in North Carolina. The same thing should be true of doctors. Now, state licensing boards will hate that, but it will be good for patients, good for healthcare costs, and good for the overall health of our citizens.
Thank you, Dr. Gade. You mentioned in there telemedicine, and that's going to be a component of our next topic, which is broadband and technology. Prior to the pandemic, the Lynchburg region's localities were working hard to improve broadband service and coverage across the underserved areas of the region. COVID-19's impact on healthcare, on education, government, and industry has made the need for reliable, high-speed internet an essential utility. CARES Act funding has supported state and local governments prioritizing broadband initiatives for telemedicine, telework, and virtual education, another thing you mentioned earlier. So two questions on this. What has the federal government done to assist better and faster deployment of high-speed internet service in the past? And the other part of the question is, what would you propose that the federal government can or should do to help deploy that to underserved areas of the Lynchburg region, but overall in Virginia?
Yeah, and the underserving of communities isn't just a rural problem. It's actually an urban problem as well, because of what we see going on in inner cities. There's far too often cases where people aren't able to do school at all because they don't have access to internet at home, so they have to go sit outside the library and things like that, and that just doesn't work. So what we need to do is we definitely need to prioritize internet access as a public good, not in the sense that the federal government should provide it, but just that we should recognize that it does matter, that it is something we should invest in as a federal government function, to help our citizens connect to a global economy. And there are a couple of ways to do that. We shouldn't be tied to laying cable in the ground necessarily, because there are a couple other generation skipping technologies which are very productive and very promising into the future. So for example, using abandoned white space on the TV spectrum that was abandoned when we went to digital TV, now there's white space and we can broadcast wireless spectrum. Number two, the SpaceX and some affiliated companies have had very good success with putting into orbit low Earth orbit satellites that are able to send broadcast broadband into areas that are otherwise totally unaccessible, with very good latency rates, very good up and down speeds, all of that. That's very, very positive. And then 5G has the potential to be a generation skipping technology that makes a lot of what we lay in cables in the ground redundant. And as long as we're protecting against nefarious Chinese action, I think we're on the right track with 5G. So there's a couple of very promising things on the horizon, and we need to be taking an all of the above approach and recognizing that this is critical for our thriving as a country.
Thank you, Dr. Gade. My follow-up question was going to be what other than new antennas and new towers, but you already hit on that with the satellite technology SpaceX is putting up there. So appreciate your answer to that question. And now we're going to reach the conclusion of our interview, and we're going to give you 3 minutes to sum up and to lay out your case for why you should be elected.
Great. Well, again, I really appreciate you all having me on and this chance to just introduce myself. I'm not a career politician, and there are lots of things that means. Number one is it means you can trust me. It means that I will always have the best interests of Virginia at heart, and I will always have the Constitution as my guiding star, and not my party, frankly. There are times when the Republican Party is right, and I'm happy to be a Republican when the party is living in accordance with its principles. And there are times when the party is absolutely wrong, and I will not hesitate to call out the party when it's wrong. And all of that puts me in sharp contrast to my opponent in this race, Mark, who has been in politics longer than I've been alive. He went to Washington, D.C., as he said, in his own words, he went to college to major in Washington, D.C., and he's been a political creature since then. Even his brief career in business was directly related to monetizing the advantages he had gained from his political connections. And that's how he made a gazillion dollars. And that's something that the people of Virginia don't know very well, but it's been well publicized and written about. And then the last thing that is true about him is that he is a party line Democrat voter. So when he goes to Washington, D.C., he's forgotten the needs of Virginia, and what he does there is rubber stamp what his party comes up with. And that's the wrong approach. I will never be a rubber stamp for my party. I will never be a rubber stamp for anything but the people of Virginia and the Constitution. And so what I'm hoping is that in November or before, when people go vote, that when they step in the booth, they'll carefully consider the fact that regardless of what happens at the top of the ticket, regardless of what happens in the down ballot races, for my race, the people of Virginia have a very specific choice, and that is between a career politician and a career servant. And I'm hoping that they will choose the latter and do something different than what they've done in the past. So I'm excited about this race. I'm excited to continue my service to America, and I will happily yield back whatever time I have left.
Thank you, Dr. Gade, for your time.